Hello, everybody, and welcome back to TarHeelIllustrated.com, or if you're watching on our YouTube channel, Tar Heel Illustrated. I'm THI staff writer Jacob Turner, and joining me tonight, our very own publisher, Andrew Jones. And Andrew, Selection Sunday, man. Selection Sunday was just a few hours ago. The NCAA Tournament, March Madness, is finally here, and we're here to talk about it. Carolina obviously getting that number 8 seed in the South bracket. I think it's based on some of the predictions and bracketology going in, not really a surprise that Carolina ended up as an 8 seed. There were some talks of potentially a 7, but wasn't to be. Carolina is going to open up on March 19th against number 9 seed Wisconsin. They finished 17-12 overall and 10-10 in the Big Ten. AJ, just kind of curious. We were looking at the South region before we hopped on it and kind of just looking at how it shaped out and everything. Before we kind of get into that, what is just your overall thoughts on where Carolina ended up, what seed they ended up in, and kind of their first opponent in Wisconsin? Then we can dive a little bit deeper into it after that.
Well, if people had a opportunity to see our staff text earlier today, they would know that some of the staff was in disagreement with me. But I look at this through the lens of someone who just wants to learn about the team and cover the team and tell the stories, that kind of thing. I don't look at it from a rooting interest. So I was kind of hoping Carolina would get an 8-9 game. So if they won their first game, they would get a chance to play one of the top seeds. Because the future of this program, in the next couple of years, is largely the roster that's there right now. And I think it'll be really interesting to see how this extremely young group does in a second round game against a 1 seed. So when I saw they were in 8-9, I thought, cool, that's really cool. Now, when I saw that it's Baylor, but okay, well, they're going to get a chance to play against a bunch of first round draft picks, a team that is men, a team that does just about everything right and very, very well, a team really that plays at a very high level of intensity at all times. So this is going to be a great test for the Tar Heels if they get to the second round, where they can have an opportunity for Roy Williams to say, okay, you guys see that? That's what you aspire to be. Because he's kind of building this thing from scratch because they're so young. That's what you aspire to be. So now you know what it looks like. Because in a very down year for the ACC, the Tar Heels didn't get a chance in league play to see what Baylor looks like. They did play at Iowa in early December, but Baylor is better than Iowa. Baylor is just more fortified. They do more things well. They're able to go on the road and win close games. Iowa struggled with a lot of that this year. So that would be the best team they've obviously played all year long. And it'll be a great opportunity for them to find out, okay, this is what a top seed looks like, smells like, sounds like, everything else. So I thought that was my reaction. I thought that was pretty cool. However, you got to beat Wisconsin first. If anybody's looking past Wisconsin, you don't know a whole lot about the history of the Badgers program and the fact that just 6 years ago, Wisconsin eliminated Carolina in the Sweet 16 in Los Angeles. I was out there for that one. Tar Heels had a lead about 8-minute mark, and then Sam Ducker and Frank Kaminsky and those guys took over, and Wisconsin not only beat the Tar Heels, but ended up knocking off Kentucky later on in the tournament, and they lost to Duke in the national championship game. So that was an excellent game. There is a fairly recent 2000s history of quality basketball from the Badgers. So Tar Heels are going to have their hands full in the opener.
Yeah, I agree with you, AJ. I kind of had the same reaction. It was funny. I was joking with some Carolina fans on Twitter because going into it, a lot of Carolina fans, it seemed to be worried about Carolina getting that number 8 seed and facing Gonzaga. And I was like, well, you just kind of got the next best thing in Baylor because, like you said, Baylor's no pushover. I mean, 22-2, 13-1 in Big 12 play. But like you said, you got to get past Wisconsin first, too. Let's just focus on them for a little bit before we can talk about a little bit more stuff regarding, the bracket as a whole. But Wisconsin is an interesting team. They, started out the season, won 12 of their first 15 games. But if you kind of look at their resume, and we were talking about it a little bit before we hopped on it, it's not very impressive. I mean, you look at their last win over a team with a winning record came on January 27th. 7 of the Badgers' 10 conference wins came against teams with overall losing records. So one of the things that really surprised me I did a little kind of report on looking at Carolina's, Wisconsin and the other potential opponents in Baylor or Hartford, depending on how that shakes out, which if you haven't seen, I'll put a link in the description below and check that on our website. But
Vin Baker's not playing for Hartford anymore. The old guys watching who the hell I'm talking about. Hartford didn't win that game. That's going to be a romp.
Yeah, yeah,
So
you're not lying.
whoever wins this, will play together.
Yeah, I joked with you that Wisconsin's resume is almost as unimpressive as Hartford's. But like I was saying, Wisconsin's a weird team because I was running through kind of the individual stats of the players on the team, and a lot of upperclassmen guys, a lot of seniors in that group. And like you saw when the way they started the season, I know it's been a weird year because of COVID. Like I mentioned, winning 12 of their first 15 games, but just middle of the season towards the end of it, just haven't played good basketball, haven't really been a great team. Now granted, 17-12 and 10-10 in the Big Ten, which is one of the best conferences, if not the best in the country this year, isn't horrible. I mean, especially when you look at how Carolina finished in a pretty down ACC this season. But I think Wisconsin's a tricky team. It's a team with Carolina's faced twice in the NCAA tournament before. I think 4 times overall. But like you mentioned, you can't overlook that game. If Carolina comes out and doesn't play well, which we've seen them do many a times this season, Wisconsin's a team that's capable of beating them. So yeah, I think it's an interesting matchup and one I'm kind of looking forward to seeing.
Well, the things that jump out to me about Wisconsin, both the good and the bad, from a Badgers perspective, the first thing is 7 of those 10 league wins were against teams with overall losing records. But let's
Yeah,
remember the rest of the games they played were against teams in the NCAA tournament. So
that's a good point.
there's a reason Minnesota has a losing record playing 20 games in the Big Ten. Maybe if Minnesota was in the ACC, they'd go 500 and they have a winning overall record because the ACC just wasn't very good this year. So but at the same time, you pointed it out. They haven't beaten a team in the winning record since January 27th.
It's a long
It's
time.
clear when you look at the last 6 weeks or so, the Badgers haven't been as good as they were. But in fairness, in their last 10 games, they played Iowa 3 times
Yeah,
and
it's like I
Illinois
said,
twice.
that's
They
a
also
tough
played Purdue.
conference. That's such a tough
I
conference.
mean,
Yeah.
that's a gauntlet that they've had to
Yeah.
deal with. But they're an older team. They have a lot of seniors who have played in a tournament before and have won games. I think when they were freshmen, they may have been an NIT team. I can't recall. I think they were NIT when those guys were freshmen. They were
Mhm.
in the tournament as sophomores. Nobody played in it last year, but Wisconsin would have been in the tournament last year. So so these guys have won a lot of games. And you don't win that many games when you play in the Big Ten without beating some pretty good clubs along the way. So they have beaten good teams. In fact, this year they beat Loyola Chicago. They
Mhm.
routed Louisville. What's interesting, here's two really interesting connections these two teams have to this year. They both played Louisville when the Cardinals came out of a pause.
Mhm.
Wisconsin beat them by 37, Carolina beat them by 45. That's a wash. They both lost to Marquette.
Yeah, I know. Mhm.
They both lost to Marquette.
And I
And,
think that was
that's a
early in the
rivalry
season, but
game up
mhm.
in, yeah, but Wisconsin and Marquette play every year. There's a rivalry game up there.
Mhm.
Carolina went ahead and scheduled Marquette kind of at the last minute and brought them in. And that was probably, honestly, that was probably the low point of this team's season. I think
I
that
would
they've
agree.
responded very well to that. They've been pretty good since then. Even the loss at Syracuse, look, you lose by 2 points on the road to a team that was an at-large club in the NCAA tournament. In the end, that's not a terrible loss. I think
Mhm.
people just thought, well, the turnovers and the points allowed, that kind of thing, made it a bad loss because some of the numbers were ugly. But 2 point loss in the Carrier Dome is rarely ever considered a bad loss. So I think the Tar Heels have played a lot better over the last 6 weeks than Wisconsin has. When you look at we've talked a lot about their high end performances. They didn't really have many high end performances in December and January. I
Mhm.
mean, the best game was at Pittsburgh. They won by 10.
Mhm.
Well, what does that look like on paper now? Eh. But since then, 91 points at Duke. They were 99 against Louisville. They 91 again against Duke. What they did against Notre Dame this past week in the ACC tournament, the win over Virginia Tech was real solid. The win against Florida State when they overcame a 16-point deficit. The Tar Heels have been ascending and playing really, really well at times in the last 6 weeks. Wisconsin hasn't, but again, they played a different schedule, Jacob, and I think that that's what's going to be really interesting about this tournament, and probably was very challenging for the committee to seed teams because there wasn't a whole lot of non-conference stuff to kind of really help you get a gauge of where these leagues are. Maybe if there was a full regular non-conference schedule, maybe the ACC would have had more really good wins and would be viewed a little bit differently. Maybe some of these ACC teams are better than we think they are. We've just been conditioned to look at the league that this is really down, so these clubs aren't that good. So Carolina hasn't really played a fantastic team for a couple of months. And maybe the Big Ten isn't as good as people think it is because there's not a ton of intel. But you know what? The
Mhm.
Big Ten did win the challenge pretty convincingly. So,
Yeah,
and I know
absolutely.
what my eyes tell me. I've been covering college basketball for 25 years. When I watch the
Mhm.
Big Ten, I see a different level than when I watch the ACC. So Wisconsin is more battle tested than Carolina, but Carolina's battle tested enough.
Yeah, definitely. I think, like you mentioned, the way Carolina, especially towards the end of the year, started playing some better basketball, kind of the opposite of what Wisconsin did. Play kind of struggling towards the end. Carolina kind of the opposite, playing a little bit better ball. Had a a few pretty good, really good performances, I should say, in the ACC tournament that I think is going to take a lot of confidence into the NCAAs. Go ahead.
Let me dive in real fast. I didn't interrupt you. I raised my finger this
No,
time.
you're good. You're good.
I didn't just dive in and say the heck with what you're saying, Jacob. No, it's interesting. Another little point to this is you mentioned the older guys. Wisconsin's got a lot of seniors on the roster. They're an older team that's kind of maybe trending down this way. Carolina is the 325th most experienced team in America. They're trending
Kind
this
of
way.
going up. Yeah.
That makes this an even more compelling matchup. I've seen a lot of older teams kind of yo-yo a little bit into the tournament, and they don't find the juice. I've seen a lot of younger teams that just kind of do what Carolina's doing, and you got no idea what's going to happen in their first game. I think they'll be ready to play, and they'll play well in the opener. It may not matter how well they play in the second game because it's just
Baylor's a good team.
It's a bad matchup for Carolina. But I think in this game, this is not a bad matchup for the Tar Heels. Wisconsin's not a great rebounding team. Carolina could exploit them on the glass. I think the way Carolina has been able to handle different styles lately will help too. There was a time earlier this year where they didn't handle different styles very well. They have learned to adjust to that. And let's look at it this way. They were 3 points away from beating FSU and getting to the ACC tournament finals. And in the second and third games, their starting point guard had 1 assist, and he was 6 for 26 from the floor. All right. On Thursday night, or on Friday night, rather, Garrison Brooks played in the tournament limping. He had a bad ankle. On Thursday and Friday night, Walker Kessler did not play well. On Friday, during the 3 games, Kerwin Walton made 7 shots. The Tar Heels can be a lot better than they were this past week. And we thought they were pretty impressive because they won with mettle. They won with grit. And that was something they weren't really doing much earlier this season, except the Kentucky game. It turned out Kentucky was trash. So I think there's a lot of things to like about the Tar Heels going into this tournament. And I do think they should win the first game, but I know it's going to be a tough game because older teams have at times given them trouble, and they're taking on an older team in the opener.
Yeah, I like what you said about, those guys in the ACC tournament. Carolina you mentioned Walton not playing great, not shooting very well in the tournament. You mentioned Caleb Love having some struggles. Other guys stepped up, which is great, but we haven't really seen a performance this season. Maybe there's a couple in there I'm not thinking of, potentially Louisville, which is a completely different scenario with Louisville coming out of COVID, where we've kind of seen everybody kind of click on all cylinders at the same time, if that makes sense. And I think that is something that kind of intrigues me.
Garrison didn't play.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, I'm sorry, Notre Dame.
Yeah, but overall, we haven't really seen full Carolina squad, everybody that you kind of expect to play well and make positive contributions, do it at the same time. It's always kind of been like, these 3 or 4 guys do it, and these 2 guys have a little off night, something like that. So that's something that Carolina can get hot, click on all cylinders at the same time. I think it's a very interesting, thing, and who knows, maybe they could make a run. But like I said, looking at that Baylor matchup, that's a tough one. And like you mentioned, Baylor's one of the best teams in the country. But AJ, before we wrap this thing up, let's take a look at this South region maybe a little bit more as a whole, and kind of dive into that a little bit more. Not too in depth because I know there's a ton of teams in it, but top 4 seeds in it: Baylor, number 2 Ohio State, number 3 Arkansas, and number 4 Purdue. We were talking about it a little bit before we hopped on, but I mean, it's not the worst bracket in the world. I mean, I know getting past Baylor, and I know Wisconsin's a tough team, and then getting past Baylor is going to be a very, very tough ask for this Carolina team. But and there's a big if on that, Carolina could get past those teams. I mean, you're looking at the teams they would ultimately come up against. Villanova and Winthrop play in the opening round, and then Purdue and North Texas. Villanova's a 5 seed, Purdue's the 4 seed. So probably either going to play Villanova or Purdue, although, Villanova's opponent in Winthrop is 23-1 this year. They're having a spectacular year down there. But, you're either going to think you're probably going to play a Villanova team that's been pretty good this season, but not reaching the heights they have in previous years, sitting at a 5 seed, and then Purdue 18-9 overall is the 4 seed. So if Carolina can get past Baylor and first get past Wisconsin, I mean, I think overall it's not really a bracket or a region, that you look at and you're just like, there's no way in heck Carolina, even if they get past the number 1 seed, can get out of this. I know it's going to be a tough ask, but like I mentioned, it's not horrible, for lack of a better word.
Yeah, every year, well, almost every year, there's a team that wins a Power 5 conference that's just cruising.
Yeah.
And they get a really, really high seed, and then they struggle when they get in the tournament because there's a sense of satisfaction after winning the conference tournament. And when I look at Ohio State, Buckeyes weren't great closing the year. They lost some games. They lost on their home floor a couple of times. They weren't great closing the year. In the last few weeks of the regular season, when I would watch them, I thought to myself, everyone keeps mentioning them in the same sentence with Michigan and Illinois and Iowa, and I'm not seeing it. But then what happened this weekend? Then suddenly we saw it. So I wonder if there's a sense of satisfaction there. They're going to have to regenerate in a few days, and they shouldn't have any trouble with Oral Roberts. But they get in that second game, Virginia Tech or Florida. That's a really dangerous game for a club like Ohio State. And my thinking is, if Ohio State isn't going to get to an Elite Eight, they're going to get knocked out in the second round. Probably wouldn't be the Sweet 16. So if there's a 2 seed that may not get that far, that's from a power conference, because I'm not going to be sold on Houston until I see them go really far in this tournament. And I know they had a decent run a couple of years ago, but I want to see more of Houston against really good teams. We just haven't had that opportunity. They had a chance to play Gonzaga, and they didn't take it here about a month. Yeah, but when you look at that whole bracket, I'm looking at the bracket right now. I think Villanova, they were really good. Then they had a pause. They kind of had issues since then. Purdue's a nice team. Purdue's a team to look out for the next couple of years. I think that's a club that could be really, really good again. Paul Painter has done a really good job there. Arkansas is dangerous, but Arkansas plays a way that Carolina would embrace. I think that would be kind of a fun game, and I don't think the Tar Heels will deal with Virginia Tech again.
No, probably not.
I seriously doubt both of them. If they met, it would be an Elite Eight. So I doubt that's going to happen. I think, usually when Carolina fans and we who cover Carolina, or when I've covered Duke, you would look at the whole bracket and say, okay, who's a threat to them in this region? Carolina's not the kind of team this year where you wonder who's a threat to them, because pretty much everybody in that bracket would be a threat to this team if they're not playing super well, and if they're turning the ball over and they're not hitting from 3. I mean, the recipe's pretty simple when they don't win. So I think get through Wisconsin first. And if they get to Wisconsin and they're competitive with Baylor, I think that would be a pretty good run, especially with what they did in Greensboro this past week. I think it'll be something to build off of. And I'll go back to saying what I was saying before. If they can beat Wisconsin, the importance of just taking the floor with a 1 seed for these young kids so they can see what that's like. Maybe they pull one off. The 2000 team was in an 8-9 game, and they knocked off the number 1 seed, and they got to the Final Four. Joe Forte is a freshman. Ed Cota was a senior, took them to the Final Four. I don't know if this club has that kind of run in them. Maybe they do. I think their high end has been pretty impressive lately, but they're so inconsistent. It's just hard to imagine them making a run where they win 4 straight without stuff happening in front of them. That 2000 team beat the 1 seed in the second round, and they beat the 4 seed in the Sweet 16, but they did get a 7 seed in the regional final, by the way, Tulsa, coached by Bill Self. So, and I think he ended up in Illinois the next year. So I'm not looking at this bracket to look at the other teams thinking, okay, who could pose a threat to Carolina? Because pretty much everybody in there can. Carolina fans just got to think about Wisconsin. Think about the Badgers. Don't entertain thoughts about Baylor just yet. Just think about the Badgers. It's going to be a tough enough game. Tar Heels have got to play well, play smart, play clean, because Wisconsin doesn't beat itself. They're very low on the high ranking on the assist to turnover ratio. They're very good in that respect. So I'm looking forward to seeing what this club's made of. My favorite thing about covering this is, and you've been working with me for 3 years now. I tell you that I want to chronicle the story. I want to see what unfolds. And there's another chapter for this team to write, and I'm looking forward to seeing what that chapter is.
Yeah, and before we wrap this thing up, one thing I want to mention, you'll obviously be up there in Indianapolis. I know it's going to be a little bit of a different experience overall, but what are your kind of thoughts on finally getting to cover an NCAA tournament again, albeit in one location and for exclusively one location? But I mean, I imagine you got to be pretty excited for it because it's been a while for you.
Yeah, well, I mean, it's been a while for everybody.
Not that Carolina was getting it last year regardless, but,
No, they weren't going to be. My last NCAA tournament game was the Sweet 16 loss to Auburn 2 years ago in a locker room that that team wasn't feeling very well physically.
Yeah, I can imagine.
So there were some interesting storylines to that. And, the next day was when Brett and I drove to Lawrence, Kansas, and got to see Allen Fieldhouse. And you kind of realized, I understand where Roy talks about this all the time. This place is unbelievable. So, I think this is my 17th NCAA tournament. I have to go back and look, but I've covered a lot of NCAA tournament games. I believe 17, and to cover quite a few Final Fours. I don't think I'm covering a Final Four this year, maybe next year. And that's what the next the next week or so could play a role in whatever this club becomes next year. That's why it's so important, in my opinion. So I'm looking forward to it. Part of the storyline will be the limited access for the media. One of the things I've always loved about covering the NCAA tournament is the media access the day before games. because we're there at the building and the locker room's open for an hour. You get to go in there and talk to players, find all kinds of storylines. On the day before the first round, the day before the Sweet 16, it's an open practice out there, so you get to have some fun with that. And we're not going to have any of that stuff this year. I don't even really know exactly how it's going to be laid out. And there's limited media. There's only 5 media credentials, 5 media credentials per team. So whoever covers teams, they only have 5 credentials of the media that covers those teams are afforded each club. So it'll be an honor and a blessing to be there. That's for sure.
Yeah, definitely, AJ. I know we're all looking forward here at THI, and obviously, like I said, AJ will be up there in Indianapolis for Carolina's opening round matchup against Wisconsin on March 19th. But I think we're a good place to wrap it up there, AJ. We kind of dove into what I wanted to touch on, and like I said, am I expecting a national championship run from the Heels this season? Absolutely not. But a couple interesting opening round games potentially that I think will be.
I have a question for you.
Yeah, go ahead.
I have a question for you. Who's coming out of the region? People are going to want to know who we picked to come out of the region. So go ahead. Who's coming out of the region?
I don't want to take the cop out and the easy route. Yeah, I was about to say, I was kind of sitting here like, man, I don't want to take the cop out and do the easy pick. But I just, looking at this bracket like we've kind of discussed, I just don't see anybody in that bracket. I mean, I know it's the NCAA tournament. Anything can happen on any given night. But if I was a betting man, which I'm not, I would definitely have to take Baylor in this situation just because I just don't see anybody beating them. Yeah, I just don't see anybody beating them. And Baylor's a fantastic team. I know they obviously lost in the Big 12 championship to Oklahoma State. I think it was yesterday, but that might give a little fuel to their fire and just make them want to push harder and get that NCAA championship. So yeah, I'm taking Baylor in that one. And like you said, you're taking Baylor too. So
okay, is there have someone 5 seed and lower? You got to pick one. It doesn't mean you're picking them to get there, but. I'm having a hard time. I'm looking at it right now. I'm flying by the seat of my pants here, Jacob.
Mm-hmm.
There are a lot of people in Carolina because they're going to see it.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, Winthrop's sitting. I know this is a horrible pick, but Winthrop's sitting there at 23-1. I mean, they got the best record in the bracket. You know what I mean? I know that it's completely different.
They're not getting to the final.
No, they're definitely not getting to the. If I had to really pick one, 5 and above, it's a tough question, man. I could see Villanova going on a run, another the 5 seed. I think like you said, they're not playing the greatest basketball after their COVID pause, but Villanova's history in the NCAA tournament kind of speaks for itself, especially in recent years. And besides that, man, I think if I had to put money on it, I'd probably go with them or, maybe potentially a Florida or Virginia Tech. I don't think any of that's likely, but I just can't see anybody beating Baylor personally. But I'm gonna. My heart tells me Winthrop. My mind tells me Villanova. So that's a big game I have to take. I'm gonna have to watch and see what happens out of that one because they're played in the first round. So who's your dark horse if you had to pick one?
I think Villanova's an easy pick, but I'm trying to think off the top of my head. They had a recent injury that kind of affected them some. They haven't been that great lately too. They've had some bad losses.
It's a tough
Florida. I mean, I'm not that. I don't think that's a great region. I think Baylor's coming out of that thing.
And I think it is too. I find it very hard to believe anybody else.
If Carolina can get past Baylor, they have a chance to win another game or two.
Yeah, absolutely. Like you said, that's a huge if because I think that's just going to be such a tough matchup for the Tar Heels. But I mean, like I said, that's why I'm sitting here like I don't know who a dark horse because I'm just looking at this bracket like nobody really there that I'm like, ooh, I kind of like what they did towards the end of the year, especially 5 and above. Maybe an Ohio State could come out of it. Maybe an Arkansas could get hot.
Arkansas's good. Arkansas's good and they're playing really well.
Yeah. So it's going to be a fun one to watch. I'm looking forward to the tournament getting started and it's going to be fun. It's fun having March Madness back. It's always a good time watching it. And, I think this is a tournament right now that I could see a handful of teams making a run and really winning this one. So it's going to be fun to see how things shake out. But yeah, like I said, AJ will be up in Indianapolis next weekend for Carolina's opening round matchup with Wisconsin. And for all your NCAA tournament coverage today and moving forward, make sure you guys keep it locked to TarHeelIllustrated.com and, of course, our YouTube channel here at Tar Heel Illustrated. I've been Jacob Turner. He's been Andrew Jones, as always, guys. If you're happy with where Carolina ended up, if you think that's kind of where you expected the Heels to be, go ahead and give this video a thumbs up, share it with your friends, subscribe to our channel. We'll see you in the next one. Thanks, guys.
Thanks.